tuned into Quick Charge, the high voltage podcast bringing you the top stories in electric vehicles and sustainable energy daily. And it's all powered by Electrek. Welcome to Quick Charge. It's October 30th, 2024, and I'm your host, Joe Boris. We've got just one day left until Halloween, but the big news today has nothing to do with candy. The Biden-Harris administration has awarded their $3 billion in Clean Ports grants. This is obviously something that was supposed to happen September 30th, but hey, September 60th is just fine. President Joe Biden took a trip to Baltimore yesterday to announce a $147 million EPA award to the city's ports, which will support electrification efforts, clean up carbon emissions, and support 2,000 union jobs at that port. But that's just a small part of the larger $3 billion announcement. That $3 billion investment from President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act will be put to use nationally in the form of 55 award selectees across 27 states and territories. You can read that as Puerto Rico, with the aim of modernizing and improving existing port infrastructure. At the same time, the funds will help port operators and drayage fleets electrify while combating the climate crisis. The White House says the Clean Ports program will support an estimated 40,000 jobs nationally across the entire economy, including 6,500 new manufacturing jobs. The awards are expected to increase demand for American-made electric cargo handling equipment at least sixfold over the life of the program. And that equipment could range from all-electric top handlers like the ones at the Port of LA, the massive 400-ton electric crane recently commissioned at the Port of San Diego, or electric drayage trucks and the charging depots associated with them. While major economic driver, our nation's ports are a major source of pollution for workers and surrounding communities. Communities living near the ports and other transportation corridors are exposed to toxic pollution, which can cause respiratory and cardiovascular harm, especially in children. The funds announced today will support the purchase of battery electric and hydrogen-powered human-operated and human-maintained equipment, including more than 1,500 units of cargo handling equipment, 1,000 drayage trucks, 10 locomotives, and 20 vessels, as well as shore power systems for ocean-going vessels, battery electric and hydrogen vehicle charging and fueling infrastructure, as well as solar power generation. In addition to the Port of Baltimore, other award winners are announcing theirs, including $322 million to the Port of Oakland, $344 million to New Jersey, and over $127 million to Delaware. The entire awards list can be seen here. We'll link to that in the show notes. Today's Clean Ports announcement helps to advance the Biden-Harris administration's Justice 40 initiative and aligns with the Biden-Harris administration's stated goal of creating a zero-emission freight sector. Now, we referenced some of these things during that article, not only some of the drayage trucks that are out there, but as well as the top handlers and the cranes at the port. So these are a big deal. Now, I may write about these things all the time, but that doesn't make me an expert. I don't live and breathe this space the way that other people do, especially other people who have a lot of their time, money, and careers in that sector. That's why I reached out to my good friend, Paul Gioupis over at Zeem Solutions. Paul was one of our first guests on the show. He's going to be a guest again today. He is one of the founders of Zeem, a company that manages everything when it comes to electrification, packaging, not only the charging as a service, but maintenance, repairs, and even the vehicle payments as well. So if anybody is qualified to talk about what this kind of influx of funds means for the drayage industry, for the logistics industry, it is certainly my friend Paul. Paul, thanks so much for being on the show.
Great to be here, Joe.
Now, Paul, you work and Zeem works primarily in this space, in this drayage space. For people who are casual listeners who may not be familiar with the heavy equipment world or the infrastructure logistics world, can you explain what drayage is and why news like this and funding like this is so important to drayage operations?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of confusion around what is drayage? What is over the road? It's very confusing for those that don't really understand trucking. Drayage is a very specific application. You have either coming in on rail or coming in on ships. You have containers that are coming into the United States. They typically will hit a port or a rail yard, and then from that point forward, they need to grab that container, put on the back of a chassis of a truck, and deliver it to a warehouse, a cross dock, or to its final destination. The way that drayage works is they're paid by the container movement. So those drayage operators will come into a port location, and their mission every single day is to pick up and drop off as many drayage containers as they possibly could to make their money throughout the day. So there's a very specific rate for picking up that box, dropping it off at a destination, and then returning with an empty. And that is the typical drayage run that you will see at most ports and rail yards.
So your company does a lot of different work within this space, right? And we've talked to you before. I'll put a link to the previous interview in the show notes. We don't need to rehash a whole lot of that here, but I think a quick 30-second overview of how you service the drayage industry, I think, is important for people who are hearing you for the first time.
Great, absolutely. First things first, we're putting in what we call mixed fleet depots into these port locations. So what we're doing is we design, we construct and operate EV infrastructure directly at the origin or destination for fleet. So ports and airports being some of those, and rail yards. So what we do is we put in very large, high capacity charging infrastructure. We accommodate overnight charging, and typically we're putting in about 40 DC fast chargers that are dual port. So we have 80 ports. We could service roughly 200 vehicles overnight, and then another 200 to 300 vehicles throughout the day. So each location, we're looking for about 500 vehicles on phase one to be able to charge throughout the day and overnight. So for us, we're providing that service as a 24/7, 365, where you could have one stop where you lease the vehicle, park it at that destination. We do the service, the maintenance, vehicle washing, and take care of everything for the fleet. The only thing they do is send their driver to pick it up and drop it off.
Now, that's really interesting. And I think a lot of people are going to be really excited to learn about you guys. But I think one of the things that we often overlook is that a number of port operations prior to legislation requiring it had already begun to electrify, whether that was overseas or here in the US. DHL's operation very famously is electrifying its drayage operations here in Chicago and in throughout Illinois. There have been other attempts to electrify different port operations throughout the country. Is there a reason that electrification does well at these port scenarios?
So the reason why EVs are really good is because you have predictable range that's already built into these vehicles. So if you know that you're going to select a certain truck, taking a Class 8 tractor, that's always going to run, that's going to be the typical application to run drayage. You have a certain range requirement, and drayage operations always have fixed routes. They're picking up at the port, usually a full container, going to a destination, dropping off that full, picking up an empty, and coming back. It's a fixed route, and they're typically fixed routes for a number of years. These are contracts that are typically 1 year in term, and then they renew. And we have many operators that have the same contract ongoing for the last 10, 15 years. So it happens because of the fixed route and knowing that you could actually predict every bit of your cost in an electric truck. That's the appeal with drayage, right? So if you know you're buying a piece of equipment, even if it's expensive, and what the cost is to charge it, to maintain it, if it's got a fixed route and it's staying within that destination, there is no better way to have a flat cost that doesn't bounce around with the cost of fuel or maintenance, et cetera. And that is the significant appeal to an electric truck and drayage operations.
So one of the big reasons that people point to electrification or even hydrogen, natural gas, any of that, and say this is the reason why it's not going to work, is this concept of downtime, that the vehicle is going to have to go down in order to charge. Now, I've seen some of your operations. I've seen some of your, I don't want to say this dismissively because I think it's very impressive. I've seen your slide decks. I've seen some of the numbers and graphs that you present to other companies that approach you. And it seems like you actually have less downtime in these EVs, the way you're running them, than diesel operators do, because then they have to get the operators to take effectively time away from doing their job to refuel, while you're doing that during the vehicle's downtime when nobody's going to be driving it anyway.
That's exactly right. I mean, let's just be honest. EVs are very imperfect. And so are diesels, right? But right now there's certainly a stigmatism around EVs. So we want to make sure that at night, when that vehicle returns, that we have the opportunity to perform the service and the maintenance that's required when the vehicle's dropped off and it's fully charged. So we've made that very much a pattern in our business. So since 2000, when we first started charging here in 2021, we wanted to make sure that all the service repair work is done between sort of 8 o'clock at night and 5 o'clock in the morning. And we've been very successful at maintaining that out of our sites today, with over nearly 75 vehicles in the fleet that we have to maintain out of that site. So the downtime using an EV is very much part of the as a service that Zeem offers. If you were to be a regular operator dealing with a dealer like a Volvo or a Daimler dealer, you would expect that when the vehicle goes down, they're going to open up at 8 o'clock in the morning, ask you to bring that vehicle in for service, and it's going to sit there for a few days. So the Zeem service is being able to take that vehicle overnight, perform that service, and even some of the troubleshooting, warranty work, repair work could be done with us overnight and eliminating that downtime. That's a big part of Zeem's offering, right? Because again, vehicles are imperfect. We don't build the vehicles. We don't build the chargers, but our service is to make sure that we provide the performance that it actually starts and it'll actually do the duty that it was meant to do.
Now, I don't want to turn this into a 20-minute Zeem commercial, but that always happens when you and I talk. I think you and I see the world in a very similar way and understand what needs to happen for these vehicles to be successful. When you call a dealership, and it doesn't matter, I mean, at this point, it don't matter if you're driving an International, a Volvo, a Peterbilt, a Western Star. If you call the dealer and they need to service your vehicle and they need a part, 9 times out of 10, you're going to wait several days, several weeks for that part. And you guys, and I think one of the things that you and I really bonded about was that, number one, that complaint and that pain point, and the way that you guys are solving it by inventorying, carrying an inventory of your own parts that you know are common wear items. Why is that so difficult for modern dealerships to understand that in order to keep their customers on the road so they can afford to come in and buy these new trucks, you need to be able to support those vehicles, and they just don't seem to carry any parts at all?
It's a really, really good question, Joe. What it is, they're used to operating diesel. They dabbled a little bit in CNG. So what happens is in the diesel requirement, you better believe there's parts in inventory and they're ready to go. My opinion is that just not 100% serious yet about EV, and they don't understand what breaks. What are some of the first things that are going to go on an EV versus a diesel vehicle? So what happens is whenever we start dealing with the OEM, I bring my service team with me, my maintenance team, and some of the engineers that know the architecture of the vehicle very well. And I have them tell me what's going to break. What should we have in spare parts sitting in the depot? What the OEMs really enjoy and like is that we have knowledge and skill to be able to actually perform service work on the vehicles. So they're far more comfortable dropping a wire harness, just about every bit of part except for the batteries themselves, because batteries are expensive and it's also difficult to inventory those kind of parts. Everything else, though, Zeem is able to repair. They're typically 4 or 6 bolts and a plug. So what's great about EVs, they're easier to maintain. So I would say that, with us, we, as part of as a service, we know that certain things are going to break on that truck, and rather get ahead of it, make sure that we do that for our customer. We know that that's part of the EV ecosystem. The dealers today, they're ticking a box for EV. So they're just, providing a truck. A lot of the service work, et cetera, is really secondary in their mind because they're not really pushing EV in my mind. They're pushing diesel. And right now, EV represents, call it 1% or less of the volume of what they're putting out there. And so parts and spare parts and being mindful of shortening the downtime is just not tip of mind for those OEMs, which it shouldn't be. 99% of their vehicles that are on the road are diesel. So their mindset is going to be wrapped around diesel.
So as you say that, I have to point out, you've got a Tesla semi-truck model sitting right in view of camera there. And now that's a company, and there's others out there as well, whether you're talking about Windrose or Lion Electric or any of those, that are 100% invested and bought into electric. Do you find that they approach that parts requirement, that support requirement, a little more seriously than some of the other OEMs?
I do. What I really like about companies that are only doing EV, right, is they're actually looking for the feedback. We've been operating now for a couple of years. So when we sit down and tell them these are some of the things that are going to break, they're immediately bracing and trying to answer things like batteries. No, these are mirrors and door handles and simple little things that from a safety perspective, if these go down, you can't operate the truck, right? So what happens is the OEMs who are doing ground up EV are asking us for the feedback, and then they're providing that as part of the purchase order. I think that's what's key. When you go to a traditional OEM that makes diesel vehicles, they look at you like you're crazy. First of all, the truck is so overpriced. When you start asking for spare parts, you could throw up in your mouth on the cost of those spare parts. My mindset is you need to keep those parts at our site. The same way that you would at a Napa Auto Parts or at an AutoZone, right? You know that there's X amount of Chevy Bolts in the market, or, any kind of vehicle. So what happens is Napa and these types, they store inventory knowing that those vehicles are out there. EVs are nascent. So it happens, especially commercial vehicles. So what needs to happen is you need to look at the Zeems. You got to look at those groups that are actually servicing those vehicles. Make sure you keep the spare parts in hand and really know your product. If you know your product, you know what's going to go down. It's not going to be the motor. It's not going to be the controller. It's not going to be the wire harnessing. It's going to be things like your connectors. It's going to be some of the sensors in the vehicle. So it's that kind of stuff that you need to be mindful and ready. Another part that tends to go quite a bit is the inverter when you're trying to charge these vehicles. So everybody talks about the handshake and interoperability. Well, sometimes you get the handshake, but you're pulling 30 kilowatt hours when you need to pull 200, right? Those are some other issues that start to come up. So you need to have them for the vehicle and the charger. So Zeem is very much minded right from the beginning from both of those perspectives. So I think what's great about we only build EVs. So the Lions, the Teslas, they're very aware of what parts need to be there. And then they're also appreciative when they run into a Zeem who says, we need to have these spare parts because now we keep their vehicles on the road, better performance. When you go to some of these others, you run into franchise issues. Well, you're in a location that XYZ dealer is there. You need to bring the vehicle there. Well, at 3:30 in the morning, if I have a minor troubleshooting issue, I'm not going to do that. I need to get my customer out the door. That's part of Zeem's as a service. So it defies how we operate, right? And so we tell those traditional OEMs, if you're not going to do business with us in a way that makes sense to us, we're going to gravitate to those that are doing ground up design, only thinking about EV. And that's where the Teslas, the Windrows, and other products come into play because they realize that's the only way that the vehicle will be successful. And then they realize Zeem is a counterparty to help them be successful with their own product.
I'm glad you brought up windrows because I was struggling with this. Whenever you see a big pro labor announcement, whenever you see conversations about state minimum wages going up, almost immediately after you see news about automation, you see increased automation, whether it's in a factory, whether it's in a restaurant, it doesn't matter. One comes after the other. So when you talk about windrows, I know you're very intimately familiar with some of the Chinese manufacturers, not only on the EV side, but on the charging equipment side as well. Are you seeing that next wave of automation when it comes to port technology and when it comes to, investment in the port and shipping and logistics infrastructure? Do you see that coming out of China? Do you see that coming out of Europe? And is that something that you think we'll ever have here in the States?
I think it's a really good question. I think the most recent strike really put it up to the surface and has everybody thinking about it. My personal opinion is that, yes, I see quite a bit of it in China and in Europe. I think it's going to be slower to come into the United States for the reasons that these unions are very powerful. I think automation is a very big threat at the port. But I think that it's also a distance away. I do not think it's an immediate threat in the next, call it 1 to 3 years, but certainly they're going to start bringing in automation. I think a lot of the technology advancement that I'm looking for EV is how do we distribute energy a lot more efficiently and at a better cost? So to me, we start there. You can't really automate that. And maybe in the future you could, but right now it's about how do I get power to the trucks? How do I get power to my yard goats? How do I get power to my electrical handling equipment on the site? And then what's interesting about port is how do you provide shore power, right? There's a whole number of new things that are coming to market that for a Zeem and in our scope that I think about. And that would be things like shore power, barging batteries to be able to distribute energy where needed during catastrophes, emergencies, and or areas where you can't really get power. I'm a New Yorker, right? So when you start thinking about Brooklyn or Queens in New York, if you want to try to do meaningful business there, it's hard to get the utilities there to deliver the power. It's not that the utilities don't want to do it. You're in the city. It's highly congested, and the density is like not many demographics in the world. So what happens is you're pretty limited. So to me, when I start thinking about future technology, my mind goes there. Can you power up batteries, mobilize to, for example, JFK, which is challenging to get power to a major airport like that? It's got a huge electrification initiative. My mindset is how do we look at that type of technology? So automation most certainly is a threat. I would call it a threat today. but I think that we're going to see it happening faster in China, happening more in Europe. And I think here there's a lot more defense around allowing automation to come into play in a way that let's say could threaten the U.S. Labor force.
Yeah, and I think that there's an argument there to be made on both sides that, maybe that's a good thing. You've got automation reduces safety incidents, reduces injuries, reduces accidental death. Again, there's a double-edged sword there. You mentioned getting power to these locations, and you made the idea and you mentioned the idea of barging batteries, which is one of the reasons I really like talking to you, is because you always say something I've never heard of before that I'm going to have to go spend 17 hours researching. Is that something that people are doing? Are people putting, battery energy storage systems, BESS systems into containers and putting them on the back of trains and taking them into these disaster areas? Because that seems like, yeah, obviously we should be doing that. That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, what's amazing, Joe, is in my previous life, I was an investment banker. So I would see these great ideas and I would realize, like many good ideas, you're sort of 10 to 20 years too early. What's happened is we've seen things like transporting batteries on rail, transporting batteries on wheels, right? Which is where we're focused right now. What's great is battery prices have come down substantially over the course of the last few years to a point where it's economical to actually put electrons into that battery, distribute it to a third party location, and actually discharge. And that's something that we're feverishly going after. So when you start thinking about the logistics of how that works, again, you could dump that battery power into a truck, mobilize it. You could drop it into a train, or you could drop it onto a boat, right? And right now, what you'll find is a lot of the power plants that you and I have discussed that we're building they border water, right? They have rail going through those sites. They have huge volumes of water. They have huge volumes of septic and, of course, electricity. So when you start thinking about that combination, my mind immediately goes to, it's very difficult to get power to right on the coast of the water, right? So JFK, many airports, many infrastructure points are right on those coastal areas. So to me, getting and transporting the power and being able to do it economically, I think that's the key. There's a lot of hydrogen, there's propane, there's natural gas, there's other solutions that are out there. What I'm finding, though, is that battery power at scale, right? Not one or two, products here and there. I'm talking at scale, is very economical and frankly competes with the price of power on the grid. So to me, you could, safely and economically transport electrons through batteries. And I think that you're going to see the future very much being power by tires, which is something coined by a person who works with us. He's a legend and pioneer by the name of Tom Gage. And you're going to hear more and more power by tires, not by wires. And I really love the first time he said that, and the 10th time, and now the 100th time, because it makes so much sense. And where the cost of batteries are today, it's really about, can you transport that safely, right? And that's where we're feverishly going after. So opening up these depots, multi-tenant fleet depots, going in directly right at a customer site and co-locating with the customer. And then it's, how do you distribute electrons, not only for EV charging, but down the road for distributed energy purposes. So buffering grid, all the other ancillary opportunities that come with a solution like a mobile battery, very much at the forefront of Zeem.
Absolutely awesome. I thought this was going to be a 10-minute call. I could talk to you for 10 hours. So we're coming to the end of our time commitment. I really appreciate you hopping on to talk to me today, especially in light of the short notice with this port announcement last night. So I really appreciate you. For the listeners who are checking this out, hearing about you for the first time, where can they go to find out more about you and what you guys are doing?
So the best thing is, first of all, to come to LAX and see the operation. As I've mentioned to you, we broke 1,000 charge sessions last week, right? In one single day. You have to see that, right? Number two, we have a website. It's not quite reflective of 100% of what we do. And that's purposeful. Right now, we're in the early days. I care about our customer. I don't care about the outward facing to the world, but that's about to change because we've now proven that we could do this and I can scale it. So now what's going to happen is you'll see a revamp of the website. So in about 60 days, you'll see a 100% reflection of what we do. But the key is coming directly to see what Zeem is doing at LAX. That'd be the best thing. Come on and listen to podcasts like what you're doing today, Joe. I think you've gotten ahead of Zeem in a really good way. We're not big on social media. So what happens in order to find out more about us, it's through channels like yourself. And I really appreciate how persistent you've been with us. For me, it's about fleets that really want to understand, how do I electrify? How do I do that at a reasonable cost that's competitive to diesel or even below? And then most importantly, could I actually be hugely competitive and make significant money, more money than I do now with my diesel operating EV? I think our team are the best on the planet right now to be able to explain how a fleet, how a sustainability manager, et cetera, how they could actually achieve that.
Once again, Paul Gioupis, always a pleasure, always a great excuse to have my buddies on the show so we could talk about cool stuff like heavy equipment, top handlers, material handlers, and of course, electrification. That's all I've got for today, October 30th. May or may not be here tomorrow on Halloween. It'll all depend on how badly I want you to see me dressed up as the Macho Man, the late, great Randy Savage. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss it.